Welcome to the Whiskey Vault. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy Whiskey Marketing School. I'm tired, just a heads up. It's been a long week already. I'm recording this after having just worked 45 plus hours in 2.5 days. Just kidding. I'm not going to do that. That's insane. That's so much whiskey. Okay. I'd never be able to shoot the other 3 episodes. What a mess. So, light whiskey. Today we're talking about light whiskey. And it's because I think it's coming back in a very different way in the U.S. And I think it's inevitable, and I think there are reasons for it. But first, what the heck is light whiskey in America? Well, there's reason. I'm drinking Kilbeggan single grain. Because that's what light whiskey is. Single grain. It's what Ireland and Scotland calls single grain. Now, let's clarify. Is it the same whiskey but with less calories? No. Is it the same whiskey but with less flavor? Yeah. It's a column distillation instead of pot still. Strips in. It was a product that got created when column stills were invented. You know, you had Stein and the Haig family, and then you had NAS coffee. You had another, even predating that one, there's another version of it, but it's the Industrial Revolution of whiskey production. And they start doing continual distillation in column stills, but it strips a lot of the flavor compounds out. There's a whole argument over like 100 years on whether or not it's actually whiskey. It gets resolved in 1919. We talked about this, or 1909. In the Islington Borough, and then the Royal Commission in the UK decides, yep, that's whiskey. And then you get the difference between grain whiskey and pot still whiskey. Well, in America, it took another 60 years for that to go down. And what happened was they were sort of plugging along, and they used column stills in the bourbon industry. But they didn't use them the same way that the Scots and Irish were used doing column distillation, which is just pure column, almost vodka. And it really is. It's like a percentage point below vodka on most of the column distillation stuff. Bourbon is using it more as a stripping run with a pot doubler or a combo, or they're running a column but taking their percentages at a lower cut. Because remember, if you want to make bourbon, it's got to be under 160 proof when it comes off. The distillation product has to be under 160 proof. Well, in the late 1950s, 60s, post-World War II, effectively, there's a big shift through the Korean War and the Vietnam War era as things away from drinking the whiskey your parents used to drink and towards drinking vodka and gin and a little bit of tequila, but mostly vodka and gin. There's even a cocktail called the Moscow Mule that gets popularized in Hollywood Party and sort of drives forward this the drinking of vodka is a new trendy thing to do. And the whiskey sales drop. And then there's a crisis. And the big boys, not all of them, some of them were like, hey, we should start distilling lighter spirits and calling it whiskey. And so they wanted to break the rule that had been put in place that said you couldn't distill bourbon, rye, or malt or over 160 proof. So they could get a lighter spirit to try to compete with these neat, clean spirits that the big brands were making money on. Terrible idea. Hey, we can be like that too. Hey, guys. Hey, I know horses are cool right now, and I'm a wolf, but if I just wear this horse saddle and costume, maybe I can fit in. And so they petitioned the what now is the TTB, used to be ATF, to try to let them violate that 160 ceiling. And there was big pushback from other producers in the bourbon industry who were like, no, that is a violation of everything that is the spirit of bourbon. Thank God. And the ATF compromised like Solomon with a baby and said, I tell you what, we'll let you distill above 160 and below 190, because at 195 now you're vodka, right? So in between 160 and 190, you can distill up to there with column stills. And you will let you call it light whiskey. Now, you have to make it from grain, just like the rest of the whiskey category, and you have to age it in used oak or uncharred oak. Very weird requirement, but it separates it from bourbon and rye, right? They're like, oh, great. Now, what does that sound like? If you look at world regulations, distilled just below vodka, grain base, column distillation, mostly used oak aged. Single grain, baby. That's grain whiskey in Ireland and Scotland. So America's sort of struggling and figuring out, and the distillers were like, hey, we got it. Fine, light whiskey, that's great. Now, why did they call it light whiskey instead of grain whiskey? That's a whole other thing. They just started putting a bunch of it down. And for a while, all the way through into the late 80s, they were putting down light whiskey thinking, yeah, this is going to be a thing. Hey, this is going to be a thing. Turns out, it wasn't a thing. And then around that same time, Maker's Mark comes out, and they're like, you know what, screw you guys, we're going to make real bourbon, and we're going to make it real expensive. And they did, and it took off. And then this whole shift towards luxury bourbon started to go in with Blanton's and Single Barrel, and then, the Knob Creek, Basil, Baker, Booker's, and all, and so on. And there was a shift back into whiskey again. Starting into the 90s, it starts coming back around again. And in the meantime, all these barrels of light whiskey are aging all over, and no one's selling them. They're getting dumped into blends for like really cheap budget stuff, like Kessler's and things like that. They're doing, I don't know that Kessler's actually had it. I should take that back. But it was so bad that at one point, you could get a barrel, and I did, of 15-year-old light whiskey from MGP under $1,000. I got mine for $600. We'll talk about that in a second, but first let's try Kilbeggan. Kilbeggan has a really long Irish whiskey history distillation, but they sort of like went along for a long time, then had financial problems, then closed, then they completely shuttered, but they kept it alive by the locals, just sort of like, we're not going to let this thing go. This is our distillery. And they kept the license active. And then in the 80s, Cooley, which was the first new independent distillery in Ireland post the consolidation of IDL, Cooley buys up the Kilbeggan stock and starts using it to kind of release. And then eventually, Cooley reopens Kilbeggan and starts production again. And it becomes another, just like Cooley, a sourced whiskey distillery in the sense that like the majority of its product is going to other people who need Irish whiskey for their brands and their blends. But they've also released their own single grain, among other. They also did a rye, which we reviewed on the channel. But remember, single grain in Scotland, distilled just below vodka, made from grain, aged in oak, aged at least 3 years, just like all the others. This is the basis of blended Irish, where because it's easier to make, it's cheaper, right? So you put in a base of grain, and then you add malt or pot still to sort of round out the flavor profile, and then that gives you, Jameson budget line, the Powers Jameson line, the Bushmills budget line, and that's what there is right now in nerd circles, a shift to trying really interesting single grain whiskeys. And SMWS has contributed to this because Scotch Malt Whiskey Society has released a bunch of single grains. Independent bottlers are releasing, and they're cheap for the age statement. So you can get, $500, you can get a 30-year-old single grain Scottish whiskey. And so it's interesting. I think you need to think of this more as Canadian. Big brand, easy drinking, a little softer, a little less drama. And we're going to nose it after all that talking. Yep. Man, if you handed this to me and did not tell me this was from Ireland, my absolute first guess would have been Canadian whiskey. Super vanilla bomb, really thin, a little bit of metallic. This is going to go really well in a cocktail. Coconut, a little bit of toasted coconut. I don't know how old this is. There's no age statement on it. Oh, wow, they said toasted coconut on the tasting notes. That's pretty good. On their own tasting notes, it says rich vanilla and toasted coconut. Well, they hit that one right on the money. Oh, now they say it's ex-bourbon barrels and then some fortified wine barrels for a softer, sweeter finish. So we'll see. Yeah, soft, sweet candy, hard candy. A cocktail, a highball. This would go really great in a highball. Very sweet. Not a lot of complexity. It's very gentle. But it's nice. For a single grain, again, you have to set your expectations appropriately. You do not compare this to a single malt, to a bourbon, to a rye. You put it in a lineup with other Irish blends or with a Scottish single grain, maybe Hedonism from Compass Box, which has a lot more drama going on, or maybe a Canadian whiskey lineup. It'd be right at home. But an interesting overall and very unique, cool thing to get to try because there's not a lot of them out there on the market. Now, why not just call it grain whiskey, America? And stop confusing the whole world, because America, we got to do things differently. And so they literally called it light whiskey to try to appeal to consumers. Which, I guess they were like, no one's going to know what grain whiskey is, which they're right. And no one would have known what grain whiskey was. But no one knew what light whiskey was either, and no one wanted it. You could have established the precedent. The rest of the world is mostly, the U.S. doesn't have a really big history of blending in the same way, right? Where in the Scottish-Irish way, where you're taking a grain base and adding malts and pot still stuff to sort of round out the flavors. U.S. doesn't really do that, and there's a lot of reasons why. Now what is the question? When I was at Crowded Barrel, and I think I told this story on the channel, I really wanted to create a Scottish-style blend. And I wanted to do it with a grain whiskey base and malt rounders. And so I did, and that we used 15-year-old light whiskey that I got from MGP for under $1,000 a barrel, and it was 14 when we got it. It was 15 when I dumped it out of the barrels. If you can you believe that? And then I rounded out the flavors with a bunch of American single malt, mostly Balcones, a little bit of real spirits, and that became the Magnificent Beast Jackalope, the very, very first blend that Crowded Barrel did on our own, as a new line of things, as opposed to the Texas Whiskey Blend or things like that. It won gold from the Beverage Testing Institute. It's still one of my favorite blends I've ever created, and it is very much in the spirit of Scotch blends and Irish blends. So here's my theory. I bet all the marbles that now that American single malt is a category, and now we're going to have a plethora of used oak casks available going into American single malt, and now that we're going to be able to talk about the category and the idea of single malt, that not far behind it is the idea of American blends that mimic Scotch blends and Irish blends. And at that point, we have a whole new market for light whiskey, because that's exactly what they're doing with grain whiskey in Scotland. So stay tuned. I'm going to bet all the marbles you're going to see a lot of big brands start to create Scottish and Irish style blends using American single malt. And Crowded Barrel was one of the first, which I think is cool. So cheers to you. I hope that was helpful to you, and I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to bet all the marbles that you will not regret liking and subscribing to this channel.